We've looked at oil and gas, we've looked at renewables, we're going to revisit these issues with your questions, but we're just going to take another layer off this. And to begin this, I'm going to ask Karin Kneissl to begin. Karin's bio's in there. We're not introducing people in detail other than, obviously, the key point to note about Karin is that she is a writer, an expert in energy, worked with the Austrian Foreign Ministry, and has done a lot of work on the geopolitics of oil and gas. Karin.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My first slide I would like to start with is Iraq. As Michael Klare mentioned this morning, the importance of the interaction between politics, geography. Let me add to that a quote by the former Saudi Minister of Oil, which I always enjoy putting in that context. Namely, oil alliances are more solid than Catholic marriages. You simply can't dissolve them, not even the Pope can completely cancel it. And the way Iraq was established in 1920 actually is a very good example of those very old, long-standing alliances, which, as a footnote, should also help to understand us how the West, by and large, in particular Europeans, are still perceived until today by a number of Middle Eastern players. The borders that we see today between Iraq, Syria, and we currently have in today's Middle East dilemma this influx of whatever kind of elements from Iraq into Syria puts also at risk those borders. And the Iraqi-Syrian border actually was traced along a pipeline that was established at a meeting in San Remo, northern Italy. If you ever have a chance to go to San Remo, go to Hotel Londra. You might see there's still the tablecloths where the British and the French oil men, not the diplomats, it were all the oil men, traced the lines for the pipeline that was supposed to bring oil from British-controlled mandate of Mesopotamia, later called Iraq, to the British-controlled mandate of Palestine, Port of Haifa, today in Israel. And that pipeline was the reference for the border. Now with Iraq, more or less in my eyes, at risk of implosion for many reasons, with Syria at risk of implosion for ethnic reasons and the inter-ethnic violence, plus the Shia-Sunni strife that we have seen on the rise, and wars both in Iraq, in Lebanon, and in Syria, actually proxy wars between Wahhabite, Sunni, Saudi Arabia, and Shiite Iran. So all that interplays here, and Iraq, to a large extent, was, so to say, the creation of oil politics. Iraq, not back in the 1920s, and certainly not today in 2012, is somehow in a position to exercise its right to self-determination, I would claim to say. So this risk of fragmentation of Iraq, Syria, and some other Middle Eastern countries. Syria, of course, is not so much now for the risk of oil, but if Iraq implodes, it will, and current events already show that, have an impact on Syria. It reminds me of what I try to state. World War I, in my eyes, is not yet over. World War I is still going on, in particular when it comes to all the territorial implications in the Middle East. We have seen the consequences of World War I territorial implications in the Balkans in the 1990s. We have seen it in the Caucasus. And we see it right now going on in the Middle East. And since Libya was mentioned, whether it still exists as a state, it's a very good another example at point. So territorial fragmentation is in full swing. And we are going now through some sort of post-World War I continuity. World War II finished, thanks God, on November 9th, 1989. So this is one example that I would like to mention here when it comes to current events, the way borders were drawn, pipelines first, borders came later, and they are in full swing today. Let me go to, since we are here at this map of the Middle East, also a little bit lower Iraq, Persian Gulf. Most languages I'm aware of, this water is called the Persian Gulf. However, in Arabic, it's Al-Khalij al-Arabi. It's the Arab water, the Arab Gulf. And this is the essence of the strife that is currently also going on about the control of that very water. Now, that strife is reflected also in this Saudi-Iranian rivalry. And the capsule, where it's mostly encapsulated these days, is of course Damascus and Bahrain. Now, if I may move from the Middle East a little bit further to the east, actually also one interesting semantic thing. In English, we call it the Middle East, because from London it was more to the middle, while in most continental languages I'm aware of, we call it the Near East, because to Europe it's simply very close, it's near, but that still hasn't helped the Europeans to really take a clear stance toward Near Eastern events. Now, Central Asia, the hot spot very much likened by different European strategies, in particular energy strategies, to take it into the agenda of building more energy independence from Russia, from the Middle East. So the strife for Central Asia, as Brzezinski coined it also in the 1990s, the new great game, the old great game, today also joined by China. Let me mention here in particular Turkmenistan, which I happen to know a little bit. I've been teaching there several times. Turkmenistan, like many other countries in Central Asia, is turning east. It's not turning west. Pipelines are all moving east, despite all the very uncoordinated efforts by the European Union. Just a project that rings a bell to most of you here might be the Nabucco project, which has just had its funeral, some sort of funeral a few days ago. But this project was supposed to bring inter alia natural gas from Turkmenistan via, that was the idea, a Trans-Caspian pipeline, Azerbaijan, and then further west. The Chinese were able to build within 11 months a pipeline of 1,800 kilometers crossing three difficult countries, difficult also in the sense of bilateral relations, namely Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. And they are now about to build a second and a third strang and want to enlarge it to up to 8,000 kilometers. They did it in 11 months. The Europeans have been talking 10 years about a pipeline of 3,000 kilometers. And the very uncoordinated behavior by the Europeans. I mean, Ashgabat, when you talk to Turkmen officials, they will always tell you, Europeans, you know, we had Mr. Oettinger here, we had the people from OMV here and REA, but who should we talk to in Europe? Who are the Europeans? So this is one of the many reasons. There were lots of elements why it didn't work. But apparently the Chinese national oil companies like Sinopec and others are simply behaving in a more coordinated, in a more orderly manner, and they deliver. The last slide, I will not go into that too much because Michael Klare mentioned that, and I fully subscribe to his assessment. The real hotspot is not the Persian Gulf. It is the South China Sea. I have stated over the last 3-4 months, in my eyes, there won't, I might be wrong, but in my eyes, there won't be a war in the Persian Gulf. Nobody has an interest in a war. Thanks to WikiLeaks, we know that the United States definitely doesn't have an interest. In spite of all the pushes by King Abdullah, the then Secretary of Defense, Gates, said no interest in going to war against Iran. And the real problematic situation is right now the fight about gas fields in the South China Seas. And here we have seen in particular this maybe confrontation between the Philippines and China, but this is just one example at stake, Vietnam and many others to name. China can, of course, enter here in the sense of South-South cooperation with numerous countries. And again, if we refer to larger historic patterns, I've mentioned that briefly with regard to Iraq, but it also holds true for some of the Southeast nations. Remember the fact that we were all colonialized once, and we can, so to say, altogether fight the former colonializers. This is one of the elements in trying to understand this this pattern, which has a lot of psychology in it. And the fact that the old Seven Sisters, the former Seven Sisters, are today replaced by national oil companies coming from India, from Malaysia, from China, is of course also this kind of, let's call it a little sort of revenge. We are now controlling the oil fields, not only back home, but also abroad. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. So just in terms of the take-home there, I mean, I think you've confirmed the fact that the great game continues, highlighting Michael's presentation that at least in the Middle East, the sources are becoming even more complex and difficult to access, with question marks about access to the cheaper, better, the lighter fuels. And that in terms of the geopolitics, the Chinese, with their ability to respond quickly, and the point about Europe, which Kissinger also made about who do I call when I call Europe, is coming home to roost in terms of the ability of Europe to respond quickly to issues, and that might come back to Desertec as well. One of the countries, the few countries that's actually done an official study on peak oil is Germany, and it was done, like in the US and a couple of other countries, I think, through the military, through the intelligence services. And we have here today Jörn Richert from the Bundeswehr in Germany. And perhaps, Jörn, if you'd like to give us just a little bit of background on what the 2010 study concluded, and some of your observations about the geopolitics.
Sure, thank you for first. Thanks. I titled the presentation, it's basically just some words, there's no nice slides or pictures or maps. I titled it Peak Oil and Beyond. I don't mean with that the problem of peak oil is over or anything. I'll come back to that later. I'd like to tell you something about where this study, some of you might heard of, came from, basically, if I manage to. Yeah. So I'm coming from an institution which is called the Bundeswehr Transformation Center, and from the Future Analysis Branch, which is part of that center. The center as such gives impulses for concept development and planning of the Bundeswehr. The Future Analysis Branch basically focus on explicitly future challenges in this context. The center, as well as the Future Analysis Branch, work independently and scientifically. That means that what we do does not represent the official opinion of the German Ministry of Defense or the German government. So this is basically an exercise of thinking. And this is the last point I want to have on this slide, is that we do not try to predict the future, but try to open up thinking space for, as well, the Ministry of Defense and the broader political community in case of publication. So this is a background on which we actually wrote about peak oil. Just some points on the study as such. The study was conducted to find out what happened after peak oil actually materialized, not so much if it will or when it will materialize. So there are a lot of people in the room, I think, which know way better where we are, where we go, and so on in terms of peak oil. What we really did was just having a look what could happen if peak oil is an issue and becomes real. In that terms, we developed two scenarios. One was called the moderate scenario, the other one was the worst case scenario. And what we saw after doing workshops and expert interviews and a lot of discussion and so on, was that in the moderate scenario, we will also definitely have increasing resource nationalism. So those who have the resources will probably use them for their own goals. We will probably have a new push for vertical integration. We have geopolitical tensions and probably something like a mobility crisis in importers. So when fuels become a lot more expensive, you will have repercussions for the life in Western states as well, and probably also in emerging economies, which could then translate into also a loss of trust in governmental systems and so on, political crises. What was more striking was the worst case scenario, which assumed a global depression, like an economic depression for a long time, and might then lead towards a breakdown of global trade, including banking crisis, state finance crisis. So we'll have what we basically saw in the trailer of the movie, which is going to be produced soon. An end of what we know as well, Western capitalism and the world as we know it, including a food crisis, probably on a large scale. So this is a worst case scenario. This we call the worst case, and this is a scenario, so this is no prediction of the future. But this is what came out. Next, this is beyond the peak oil study, so it's not so much beyond peak oil as such. The main recommendations we drew from that was that the world should go into a post-fossil future. That means transforming energy systems, transforming means of transportation, and so on and so forth. And that's also an important point for armies and the Bundeswehr in particular. The reaction on the study was actually surprised us to a certain degree, because there was a lot of reaction in the German media as well as in the Bundestag, so the German parliament. The opposition actually started a discussion about the study in the parliament. Members of the center had to go to different Senate or like Bundestag hearings. And so on. The Bundeswehr itself got really aware of that problem at that moment, also a lot because of the pressure from the outside. And you had afterwards the effect that we wished for, or the future branch wished for, and that was that the Bundeswehr actually tried to get to know how they could use energy efficiency measures and go into post-fossil energy supply sources like transports and so on and so forth. Those are things which are still going on today. It's a bit hard to track the effect down to the ground where actually the real decisions are made. But I think we actually managed to push the Bundeswehr in the right way. And by right, I mean a sustainable way and not preparing so much for geopolitics. Only last point now, what I mean by beyond the peak oil study. So we've been talking and discussing that topic as well. Non-conventional oil was big on the agenda. If you read the, I think, by now quite well-known Citibank study, it seems that peak oil is over. Today we have heard like a lot of good arguments why it is not. So that basically remains an open question. So peak oil is still a possible future, and we should go on preparing for that in the way I've just suggested. So we see our own conclusions are still relevant, particularly before the background of a broader energy and climate policy perspective. And now a lot of things which have already been said would feature in, which is like the geopolitics of renewable energies. But I would also like to highlight the stability of energy markets, which have done a great deed for the international community, particularly after, like from the mid-'80s on. And also we need, I think, this is an important point, efforts to actually go beyond fossil fuels on the international level, which comes to a global energy order and a lot of governance. And I would stop with that.
Great, thanks so much. Daniele, you're director of the Swiss Institute for Peace and Energy Research. What's your research been telling you about the geopolitics around oil and gas?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I'm from Switzerland, and I'm very strongly convinced that we are all influenced by the countries where we come from. I've now lived in Switzerland for 40 years, and if you keep in mind that Switzerland is a very small country which does not have any oil, it doesn't have any gas, so we sort of look around the world and see all these big players whom we distrust. We distrust the Russians, the Americans, the Chinese, even the Germans sometimes, but not on a personal level, right? But the point is that what we're doing at ASPA Switzerland, which we founded 6 years ago, is obviously we study all the data that is circulating in the ASPA conferences, and I think that's from my side, I want to thank all the contributors, Shell and everybody, for all the knowledge that we could gather at these conferences during the last 6 years. And then I set up the Swiss Institute for Peace and Energy Research to link peace and energy issues, and it's very difficult. And what I give here as an introduction is just a sketch. I tried to slip into the mind of Dick Cheney. It's obviously very difficult, but Michael Clare, you've written about it a lot. But Cheney's given this remarkable speech in '99 in London, where he said, "Peak oil is coming. We're going to have scarcity. We're going to have resource wars. Persian Gulf is where the price is." That was the summary. And then as vice president, the first thing he did in January 2001 is actually to have a national energy policy development group where he gathered everybody. And energy was a big issue in 2001 until the summer of 2001. Everybody's talking about energy. And then 9/11 happened and the whole discourse changed to terrorism. It switched from energy debate to a terrorism debate. Everything looked completely different. And obviously, we in Switzerland looked at it and thought, why did it change, and what was the background to it? In the first half of the year, it was, said the big reserves are in the Gulf. I mean, that is a graph everybody knows. And then I said, what happens to countries like Switzerland who have no oil whatsoever? How do they look at this discourse? And I said, I have to differentiate between the countries that, according to religions, and I found out that actually the green area are the Muslims, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that the oil is basically where the Muslims are. I mean, this is one of the conclusions. And in 2001, with 9/11, the image of the Muslims went down. Also in Switzerland, we, for instance, had a national vote where people said, we can't build minarets anymore, but it's just a national detail. So we had a lot of religious debate. And then I looked at the Iraq war, that we obviously had lies that led up to this war. And I came to the conclusion that this peak oil thing, which we all say when it accelerates, it will lead to crisis, it will lead to problems. I thought, do we actually understand the problems that we are already in? It's very hard to find, because politicians will not come forward and say, we will have a peak oil war tomorrow. That's not what they do. So they increase the fear of weapons of mass destruction or whatever, and then wrap a war which they sell to the public. And what I found very interesting is a debate that happened in the Japanese parliament. I think it was in 2008, if that date is correct. Japan, as we all remember, does not have any oil at all. And in World War II, when the Americans shut off the oil, the Japanese went to Pearl Harbor, and we had this clash there. So now when Japan shuts down 50 of its nuclear reactors, they have to import a lot of oil and gas to make up the energy difference. And what the Japanese did is they had an entire session on the year 2001 when one parliamentarian said, the Americans, they're not actually running to get bin Laden, they're running to get oil and gas. And that was the debate in Japan, which I found very, very interesting. It's completely different from what we had in Europe. And the man went as far as, that's this debate in the parliament, the man went as far as to go back to 9/11 and question 9/11. And now everybody comes forward and says, whoever questions 9/11 is a conspiracy nut. Forget these people, they have no clue and it's all nonsense. And I took the data to my institute and said, okay, I'll have a look at it. What is this guy actually talking about? He's showing a picture here of a building, and I actually went to search this building, and it's this third building in the back. This is Manhattan, one plane in the first, one in the second, then the towers fell, and the third building fell as well. So in Switzerland, there is a group of people, and I know I'm breaking something of a taboo here. In Switzerland, there's a group of people who questions 9/11 and puts it into the context of resource wars. I'm not sure whether that will actually break the level of the panel. Okay, some people disagree. Those who disagree can come to me later as well. I mean, I know it's a very, very difficult debate, but that's what I'm working on. I'm convinced that the reserves will not move. They will just stay where they are. And the stories, how we get to the reserves or who gets to the reserve, this story, I think, will change a lot. So that's just from my side. Thanks.
Great. Thanks very much. Well, in terms of my sum of that, and I think the group's summary of the presentations that we've heard, and Michael, perhaps I'll ask you to comment on this in a second. I think in terms of conventional oil and gas, the proposition that we have come to here is that it is not only vulnerable and has been for a long time and been the heart of the great game, but that's continuing, and that our vulnerability as importers of oil and gas from the largest reserves around the world, particularly of the cheaper and more accessible oil and gas, is only going to become more problematical, either because of breakdowns of nation states there, ethnic issues, religious issues, meddling of great powers and commercial competition, and we are forewarned on that. I think that's the sense of it. Whether we need to get into the issue of who caused it and whatever, I'm not sure that needs to be done here, and you're able to do that offline. But Michael, that's basically it, isn't it? We need to recognise, and policymakers need to recognise and make more transparent, which was Karin's point, exactly what the level of vulnerability is, and we don't have that yet. There is not a public debate on that, and even in the case of the Bundeswehr assessment that did get to some discussions in the Parliament, we're not seeing that across the board, and certainly not in the United States.
Right.
Is that a fair summary of? Would you like to comment on what you've just heard?
Yeah. Is this working? Yeah. Hi. I'm going to just add a different dimension. Sure. Is that okay? What I don't think we've discussed adequately is the political role of the giant energy corporations. I think that's missing from this discussion from geopolitics, because I think we need to add that discussion. We've been talking about countries, and I do that too. So I'm not blaming anybody, but I think that in this end game of oil, the role of the corporations and what happens is crucial. These are the most powerful, most technologically advanced, richest organizations ever created by humans. Let's remember this. And they have a business model which is to produce oil and natural gas. They are not going to give up their business model without a fight. And so they are going to resist the transition that we've seen. Now, some of these are entirely private, some are partially private, some are state-controlled, like the Chinese and the Russian companies, Brazilian companies, Indian companies. So they carry out state policy, but even when they're private, they often act out of the policies of the states from which they originate. These companies fight with each other, and that leads to geopolitical competition, but they also work together to preserve the prevailing energy paradigm. And some of the consequences of this, I'm doing a little bit of stream of consciousness, but I think it's been missing from our conversation a bit. So some of the consequences of this. The oil companies are going to try to buy the American election. I don't know if that happens in other countries, but they are going to buy this election for the Republicans with the most they've already announced. They're going to spend millions and millions of dollars. They're the biggest contributors. They are trying to preserve fossil fuels as the dominant energy source in the United States and to kill renewable energy. That is their political intent, not because they don't like renewable energy, but because they want to preserve their dominant role in the economy. They will do everything to undermine renewable energy for as long as they possibly can. Another consequence, I could say more about this if people want to ask me about it. Another consequence, the private companies, they got their start in the Middle East or the Persian Gulf area. They've been driven out of that, at least in the sense of being able to own assets. So they are going to the places where they could own assets, especially the Arctic. I wanted to speak this morning about the Arctic, and we haven't. Arctic and deep offshore areas of Africa, Brazil, and Norway, and those few places where they can. And these are areas that are where their production is going to be extremely hazardous in many ways, as well as geopolitically problematic. This summer is going to see the biggest invasion of the Arctic for oil and gas ever. And the risks are enormous, but it's because these giant companies, private companies, see that this is the one place where they could control assets. And so they're determined to do that. Shell in Alaska is starting up. They have gotten the U.S. Coast Guard to protect them against Greenpeace. The U.S. is sending a Navy, the Coast Guard Navy, to keep Greenpeace from being able to scale their, to climb up on their rigs as they begin drilling. This is what we've come to. Oh, I want to say more. But I just want us to understand in this culture that we're describing, what we're facing is the enormous political power of these organizations and how they're going to shape the future of this discussion.
Great, thanks very much. Let's move to renewables at this stage. So what we're hearing here is for reasons of access and reasons of both in the Middle East with the secure sources being gone for political reasons, moving to new regions, the Arctic, East Africa and so forth, the Spratlys, China Sea, big economic, political, strategic costs are going up enormously with all of these, and we're being sold this on the basis of price and technology, which I think is driving change. But from what I got from Karin's presentation, it's not all plain sailing either with renewables. I mean, renewables are very often locally sourced, but not always, and certainly on the scale that we're talking about with Desert Tech, we have these long supply lines as well that mirror oil pipelines, but they're just power lines. So would others just like to comment on the geopolitical balance there with this transition to our crash pad there of shifting to renewables, of the vulnerabilities that we have there, because clearly geopolitical issues remain an issue there. Karin, do you want to comment on sort of the European approach or perhaps North America or the other potential for renewables there? Just build on some of the points that you made.
Whatever you do, don't follow the American approach. As I think one of the, somebody from the audience said, it depends on who's in control, right? I mean, Carter put solar panels up on the White House roof. Reagan came in, they renovated the roof and forgot to put the solar panels back up. Reagan also tried to kill the Department of Energy. Then in comes a Democrat administration and the whole thing flip-flops again. So whatever you do, don't follow the US method for achieving it. The Europeans have a problem also, which I think Karin really highlighted, not just in their approach to Nabucco, but in their whole approach to energy. They have their national champions, which is what Michael has been saying, their national energy champions, who in Germany would rather be kind of running the policy than the German government, and there's a lot of conflict between who's in the driving seat there. So if you're asking if there's an optimal approach for how to achieve renewable energies, we haven't seen it yet. But something that I would like to bring up that we haven't discussed yet today is path dependency. Oil has decades and decades of infrastructure built to it. Our whole systems are built around oil, and it has developed path dependency. It's like you're going down a highway and it's very smooth road, and the road to renewable energies is very rocky. And so we need to do things that make not just the renewable road less rocky, right? Governments try to do that with feed-in tariffs. They try to create incentives for renewable energy, but we also have to make the oil or the hydrocarbon road more rocky, right? We have to make it less attractive. So changing consumer behavior, becoming aware of the full costs of what it is that makes that road so smooth. These are some of the things I think we have to do. So I think to become aware of the path dependency and everything we can do to break that dependency on the oil infrastructure.
Let me ask you one more question. We were talking last night about the fact that Friday, Saturday last week in Germany, a world record was set for the generation of solar power. I think it was 22 gigawatts. But of course, that night it was producing nothing. Where do you come down on the issue of the balance between grid and storage for renewables? Because that seems to me to be one of the fundamental bits of the rocky path.
Oh, this is a very, very interesting question. Daniele Kamen, who's a member of the IPC, one of the authors for the IPCC, and he runs in Berkeley, California. He runs a national lab. He's also been an advisor to Obama. His group did a huge model of the western part of the United States and this question of grid or storage. And his model showed grid. Build more grid. His model showed it's only where you have like a peninsula effect or some kind of block effect that you actually need storage. And then Jos Berskens, who's in the Netherlands, he was also at the same event. The three of us were speaking, and he says his group ran a very similar model, and it showed the exact same thing. If you really want to move electricity around, you should do it through grid and not through storage. Nonetheless, there has been a lot of investment and interest in storage. The very innovative ideas have come out that you can even put compressed air near wind turbines, and so instead of it going into the grid, you actually compress air, and then when you need to, you can release that air at night if it happens to be a night where the wind is not blowing. So there's lots of innovative ideas, but I was very impressed when both Daniel and Jos said, our studies, our models show grid.
Great. Renewable side of things, how do you, Karin, do you have a view on this, the geopolitics of grid? And renewables generally?
In the Middle East, it's not a topic. Maybe a little bit in northwestern Africa. It used to be before the events to have a solar park established from southern Algeria to provide, there was once a big scheme, it started to be developed 5-6 years ago, but it was then halted to provide the Sahel zone with electricity both from solar panels and from gas-powered kind of steam engines. Actually, the Algerian National Oil Company is very much into solar energy, like many oil companies in the Middle East, and the national oil companies of OPEC, by and large, have understood that they have to turn also into energy companies. But for the time being, of course, oil is the name of the game. And we have seen it with BP, Beyond Petroleum, yes, to a certain extent, but it's more about PR than real research and development, and that holds true for many national OPEC oil companies, but they have understood, nevertheless, that they have to become energy companies, and solar energy, of course, has a certain role in that to play. But speaking about grids, and in this difficult area of northwestern Africa, of the Middle East, in spite of certain verbal commitments to Arab unity and pan-Arabism, bilateral relations between these countries are very rigid and very difficult. To cross from one country to the other is a major undertaking, not to speak of commercial links, because of mutual suspicion that the other one is just launching a coup d'etat in my country. So
it'll be largely national in your view, as and when it occurs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here the grid reaches certain limits, but efforts are there, and numerous things are happening in Arab countries from the roots. I mean, there are lots of grassroots movements when it comes to biogas plants, when it comes to communal municipality, solar energy. This can work on a community level, but of course it doesn't reach out. And in spite of the fact that OPEC countries are, to a certain extent, depends on where you are, considered as rich, but energy poverty is still a topic in many of those countries. People wish, agendas are there to go more along conventional lines to combat energy poverty with conventional means than to combat it with others. And when you take a country like Turkmenistan, which I happen to know a little bit, it's a poor country, no doubt about that, but Turkmenbashi, the former commander-in-chief, he had this fancy idea of turning Ashgabat in such an electrified place, you say, so that you would see it from the moon as the most lighted city. And what you have then in Turkmenistan, and also to a certain extent, I must say, unfortunately, in Iran, which should have other problems to solve, is this enormous waste of electricity for political reasons. And it's also a populist, I mean, you all know these maps, satellite maps, when you see the Earth from at night, and you know where the light spots are. They are also in the oil-producing countries because highways are lightened up, and it's a matter of national honor. So there's also mentality problems to overcome, and unfortunately, I mean, I come back to those Central Asian players like Turkmenistan. There are no lessons learned, not at all, when you think of what has happened with Iraq, with Libya and others. Companies, governments are simply queuing up in order to court the autocrats in charge. Nothing has been learned, nothing at all.
Great. Any last comments on renewables? And then I'd like to have a quick discussion on international energy infrastructure, international organizations, and then we'll go to questions.
Maybe short comment on renewables. The way we measure it in Switzerland is that we go from country to country, is around 190, 95 countries, and then we measure the percentage that they have as from renewables, first for electricity, but then in total. And there's obviously huge differences from country to country. You can call it fortunate or you can call it policy, but I think Austria has 30% renewable over the entire energy mix, not just electricity. Switzerland has 20%, and I think Germany has 10%. And there will be a competition between the countries because you can say, yeah, the other country can do it. Why can't we do it? And I'm absolutely a big fan of renewables, I have to say it. I know there are huge problems ahead, but I think the only thing that gets us out of these resource wars will be more efficiency, more renewables, and also less hatred and fear, which are so widespread.
Germany, I think, is nudging 20% at least for electricity. But 10% for energy.
For electricity alone, Switzerland has 60, right? I mean, that's because of the water power. But really, the mix, if you take in the oil and the gas, the mix is the difficult thing. Sure. If a region wants to become 100% renewable, they usually speak about electricity only and don't think about the cars that run around.
Yeah, that's basically electricity, the bigger number. I would like just to comment briefly on the path dependency. One thing you can see in Germany at the moment is that like renewable energies are about to build their own path dependencies. So the cut down of the feed-in tariffs was declined by the second German chamber, the Bundesrat, because there are so many states in Germany which also have like a lot of work done in the sector. So path dependency is coming slowly, it's a long process, but we're about to get there, so this is probably a positive thing. On the geopolitics of renewable energies, there are tensions and there will always be tensions. I think about like energy lines more or less like new pipelines. They go other places, they come to our place, but in the end there is a potential that they have political implications, that they are exploited in political ways, but this is basically not a different thing. I mean, we will have tension, we have to live with it, and that will be my last point, probably going to the institutional part. I think we have to focus more on solutions and ways to get ahead instead of like just stating the obvious that there are tensions and probably great game or anything else.
Great. Now I'd like to move to international organisations. I chaired a meeting at Chatham House in London recently that was initiated by some very interesting players, including the official Chinese representatives, European Union and the United States. And while for reasons of confidentiality I can't reveal the presence of the folk involved, the proposition that we were discussing was a rather interesting one. People in the room all accepted as a premise that the current international energy architecture, international energy organizations, was not fit for purpose. It was not meeting what are called the 3 E's, the security of energy supply, the development of the economics, and environmental security. And so the question was, how are we going to deal with this? We've got an International Energy Agency that's not universal in membership. It doesn't include India and China. We've got the International Energy Forum that's largely oil and gas, does contain suppliers and producers and so forth. So it was just different. We've got IRENA doing renewable energy in another place. In other words, we've got a patchwork of bodies that none of them actually bring together the climate change, energy, transition issues that are core there. I can share with you that the outcome of that was that there was no political will for change, but there was a continuing recognition that the current infrastructure is inadequate in itself. So what I'd like to do with the panel now, just to get a quick sense from you of what do you think we could do, what we should do in terms of trying to bring these issues to a new international level of transparency and quality discussion that can influence political debate, investments, and consumer behaviour. Anyone like to take that Gordian knot?
Well, it's interesting that for instance, inside the European Union, energy is considered a chasse gardée, domaine réservé. You don't give it up. There is no such thing as a really integrated European energy strategy. There's a coordination of different energies, ways. And it's like foreign policy, it's the last essence of sovereignty and has a very strong meaning to sovereignty. So to have this sovereign control over your natural resources is not only something that comes from the south, where we had the nationalization wave. I think to the same extent it exists and it shapes decision makers' mindset that we don't give up control over those structures. And there is also...
Even though the structures don't reflect the realities on the ground.
Yeah. But you want to keep them under control. You have you want to run the show by yourself.
So you don't see any change, certainly coming out of Europe.
One of the organizations, or it's not really an international organization, it's more kind of forum, is the OSCE. Even so, we call it the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, stretching from Vancouver to Vladivostok and having a lot of associative members going right away to Australia and the Mediterranean southerners. There is a kind of had a chance over the past few years to attend some of their meetings, and it was always very enlightening to see the amount and the nature of people they could gather. Because there you had, like in Riyadh, producers and consumers plus independent academics, which would not be admitted to other fora. And here something is going on, but of course outsiders wouldn't take the OSCE serious, they say. Organization of a seriously confused Europe. Why do they now also take care of energy? They should take care of security and disarmament, etc. So there's a lot of mistrust by other diplomats, by parliamentarians. Why does the OSCE interfere here? Personally, I'm not a member I'm not paid by the OSCE, but I think that they have a role to play because it's one of these additional fora next to those you just mentioned. And I don't know whether they were invited to that meeting.
Yeah, they were.
They were, yeah. But in my eyes, they have quite a role to play. And
they made the same point at the meeting.
Yeah, well, interesting. But the fact of really interlinking, I think the idea of thinking grid-wise, trans-regional, transnational grids. You have wonderful papers on that inside the European Commission. But whenever the European Commission people, and I remember one meeting, mid-March 2006, after the first Ukrainian gas-Russia dispute, the commissioners then said at the EU Council meeting, please, heads of governments and state, give us a little bit more of power, competence that we can legislate here a little bit more. And the 27 said, no way. We don't want to give up control of that. So the grid system is, there are lots of handicaps to that. Within the European Union, to the extent I may judge, and not to speak about other countries where, in spite of all verbal commitments to some sort of unity, be it in the Gulf, be it in Central Asia, be it in North Africa, there's a lot of mutual distrust between neighboring countries.
Great. Perhaps if we pass the microphone to Jörn. Last month there was a declaration signed between China and the European Union on energy cooperation. How do you see the international architecture coming through? And is that a sign of a closer relationship or a desire for a new approach to international discussion, at least on energy issues?
Well, I think it's it's desire, probably. So people desire this new energy order. If it's going to have an effect in the long run or in the medium run, that's another question. I think it's probably a bit of an illusion trying to go for the big solution. So we've seen in the climate regime that the big thing doesn't really work. So the UNFCCC is great. It's important to get everyone on board. But if it comes down to actually taking measures and getting everything together, Copenhagen didn't really work well. So what happened afterwards is everyone turned to a pragmatic stance on how to do things, and I think that's the way to go in energy relations as well. So you won't have everyone in the IEA, and you probably have everyone in the IEF, but you don't have all the things in the IEF, so it's probably impossible to talk about climate change in a reflective way there. So you need more fora, and I think that's kind of annoying because you have to have a lot of talking between the institutions, and it's not very transparent. But I think this is a way to go. So the binding thing is basically climate change. It's peak oil. It's market volatility. So there are actually risks and challenges which hit everyone who's in one way or another involved into energy or the environment or the planet. So this is everyone.
But where do you discuss that? Is it a multi-forum approach? Is that what you're suggesting?
I think you could call it like that. So you could also call it club governance, so get together the people who are really responsible and actually have stakes in the things and try to move something. And try to have an overview, like the United Nations might be a good forum to actually establish something which goes beyond this energy website they have now, to see what's happening in the single institutions and to sort of foster coordination. But I think you will have to go the pragmatic way of dealing with different problems in different fora.
Yeah, certainly that's part of the UN Secretary-General's initiative of the Access for All. It's a multidisciplinary, multi-organization approach, recognizing that every organization claims some degree of territorial responsibility for energy.
I think there's a difference between the year of sustainable energy for all, which is a good thing, which should be pushed, and developing a fora for coordination of different forms of politics in the international realm. But both are viable initiatives and should be pushed forward.
Michael, what's your take?
I want to talk about a different kind of... Is this working? Yeah. I want to talk about a different kind of architecture, energy, and that is intercapitalist struggle. What I think will ultimately be required to make the transition from fossil fuels to renewables is the coming together of the renewable energy industry and the capitalist forces behind that to challenge the power of the fossil fuel industry. And let me make a brief analogy. I don't know if this is true in Europe, but in the United States, in the 19th century, for the first half of the 19th century, the most powerful corporations were canals. I don't know how many of you lived back then and remember that. But in the first half of the 19th century, canals were the dominant form of transportation and economy. That's how everything moved in the U.S. The New York State, the Empire State, became powerful because of the Erie Canal. And the canal owners were powerful because they controlled the state legislature and the federal government and had laws passed to facilitate the creation of canals. When the railroads came along, which challenged their domination, the canal owners used their power in state legislatures to keep railroads from being built for almost half a century. And it took the railroads, maybe not a half a century, but several decades to accumulate the economic and political power and support of constituencies to overthrow the dominance of canals before railroads actually became the dominant form of transportation, and the wealthiest corporations in the U.S., the great Vanderbilt and the other great fortunes. I totally believe that's what's going to have to happen here. Right now, the oil companies, the fossil fuel companies in the capitalist world, and I think in China and Russia as well, have the dominant control of the economy, the commanding heights, as it said, of the economy and of the political establishment. And until a countervailing force that is economic, the renewable industries and their support among the population reaches a critical mass to challenge the dominance of the fossil fuel industry, we will not see a transition. So it's to somehow create an architecture of building the assembled power of all the renewables. That's what it's going to take to challenge the entrenched political power of the fossil fuels that control the regulations, taxation, and subsidies that keep oil the dependence path. That is entrenched political power that allows that. And it's going to have to be smashed, and it's going to take an equivalent amount of countervailing power to do that.
Great, thanks. I think we move to questions and comments from the floor here. And I see about 6 arms. I'm going to begin at the back this time because I've had criticisms about ignoring the back. Gentlemen at the back, and then we'll move forward. No, that's cheating when you put your hand up afterwards.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I wonder if you could tell the audience what kind of time frame.
Can you speak up, please?
Yeah, I wonder what kind of time frame you are expecting for a scenario like at the end of the 15th century when the resource-based, the wood-based system collapsed and caused the collapse of the social systems and the sanitary systems and two black plague pandemics. Do you see a scenario like this if we keep on doing nothing about the peak oil system? Thank you.
Yeah. Are we facing collapse as a result of this?
I think one very interesting point is to look at demographics. You mentioned the 15th century. At the time zero, Christ's birth, there were 300 million people living on the planet. And then I looked at how long did it take for those 300 million to double to 600 million. And it took 1,600 years. You know, that's wood energy, basically. And now we're 7 billion. And I looked how long did it take to get from 6 to 7 billion. And it took 12 years. So just to take these two factors into account means that we are in an accelerating environment. Means problems will accelerate, but also the learning curve, I hope, will accelerate. That's a short input on that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, staying on this side, gentleman there, yes, and we'll just walk up this side.
Daniel Olive, TU Wien. Similar line of question. I would like to panel to share the vision in the light of what has been said today and heard today. Is business as usual of our economical system based on consumer capitalism and enveloped in democratic political system possible after peak oil? And if yes, how it is possible into 3 sentences? If not, what will replace it in your way, in your view? Thank you.
Well, to all of you, I mean, is business as usual, as we know it, possible after peak oil? And what's the alternative?
On the case of business as usual, it probably is a game changer. So we heard today that the end of cheap oil was already the game changer, and what came in as non-conventionals, basically the system responds. The system will respond, and I think non-conventional like the resources are a very new thing, sort of in this gale what people talk about them right now. Yeah. And I think if peak oil comes, that will have a system response. So I don't think business as usual is actually a possibility, and the scenarios we built showed just that.
Yeah, and I think we're even seeing in Harvard Business Review, crisis of capitalism, mega trends changing the game. I think there's enough evidence out there that shows business as usual is not an option. Next. Sorry, yes, please.
I just want to say a few words in answer to that question. What I think we'll see is a world like you had in the late Middle Ages, where you'll have areas of extreme poverty and distress and starvation, but there will be centers that will continue to flourish, and we don't know where they are, but there will be places that will have moved ahead, that will have developed renewables ahead of the pack, like Germany perhaps, that will remain flourishing, where other places will totally collapse. So it'll look like the Middle Ages of walled cities surrounded by total impoverishment and refugees. That's what I would imagine.
Yeah. The gentleman in the striped shirt there. Then, yeah.
My name is Robert Neunteufel. I'm working at the Chamber of Labor in Styria. And I'm half a technician, and my main profession is pedagogics, education. 2 thoughts I want to bring in the debate. One is I'm always wondering when an American president is saying if something happens in this region, it is an attack on the interests of the American people. And in Europe, I think no one would be able to say if something is happening in Egypt, it is an attack on the interests of Austria. But really every one of us who is using fuel and gas and wasting energy is part of the game. We are all responsible for the conflicts and for the energy wars all around the world. As the market is so busy in this field, it is about a lot of money, and it is not about ethics. This is one thought. And the other thought is, it's all about speed. And we had a few comments now, looking back into history. And I think we should, as ESPO, should put one message on its agenda, and that's the message that we really should take a longer view. All the views in the future, they are about 2050 or so. But take a longer view to our children, to our grandchildren, to their children, and to their grandchildren. And we are wasting the energy reserves that have been produced in millions of years, in some 10, 20, 30 years, without any responsibility for our siblings.
Thanks very much for that statement. Gentleman in the blue shirt here.
Hopefully just a quick one. The one thing none of the panelists have touched on is the global scramble for coal reserves, coal resources. Both China and India, as as we're probably all aware, are clamoring for reserves in Africa and Australia and elsewhere. Just some comments on that, please.
First, I actually wanted to respond to the comment from before. Last night at dinner, I'm not sure if he's still here in the room, but Dennis Meadows and I had a conversation similar to this, and that was, it could be that we're telling our grandchildren that we flew on airplanes and that we just turned on the light switch when we wanted lights, and they say, we can't believe you, Grandma, was it really like that? That we could be entering a period where we've lived this century of absolute luxury, and that it'll be a little blip in humans' story. And perhaps, as Michael's pointing out, there might be little islands that still live this life, but the rest of the world might be living a very, very different kind of lifestyle. And just like aviation prices might go up to the point where it will be an absolute luxury or a national necessity for someone to travel, but not for everyday people like most of us are used to. Regarding coal, that's a very good question. I mean, there's enough coal in the United States for another 130 years of electricity. I'm not sure if there's a scramble for coal, but I think coal is an issue. We haven't talked about it, but unfortunately there is not peak coal at the moment, and coal is the dirtiest thing you can burn. And I don't believe in CCS at the moment. Peak coal is coming, yeah, but not quick enough. And yeah, I'm not a fan of CCS.
Any other comments on the coal issue? I mean, certainly one of the comments we made earlier was that gas is replacing that in many cases in the United States. Michael?
I don't have anything substantive.
No? Okay, we have two questions, comments over here, then I'll work back.
Okay. I just wanted to respond to the sort of description of renewable energies and the way that geopolitical threats were talked about in terms of desert tech, because desert tech is one incarnation of renewable energies, which is a very centralized system where essentially another country is maybe even being colonized, and there's a huge technical and political requirement to ship this electricity back to Europe. I find that is really shouldn't be taken as the model for renewable energies. If you look at studies that have been made by the Öko Institute in Germany, you find that renewable energies provide a lot of regional economic value, and that this goes a long way. If you have a conflict with your neighbor over the windmill because you don't like the sound or you don't like the way it looks, when you start getting the benefits, the check, the money from that windmill, it all of a sudden starts to look a lot more beautiful. And this is true if people get the rewards from local distributed energy. It's a very different kind of system. It has very different risks than a centralized sort of colonial manifestation of renewable energy. Okay.
Well, the best practices that I was mentioning to you incorporates exactly that. How can we make sure, I mean, we're looking at what's been successfully used in Europe and what's been the approaches that have been successfully used in the United States. And compensation is clearly part of it. And understanding the health risks appropriately. And if there are health risks, then moving the wires, moving the people, or compensating for them, not just running the wires through their houses and poisoning their kids. So this is all part of trying to find out, but we need to go in with our eyes open, which is my point, and try to find out how to make this work in the best way. And the compensation, it works, you're right. I mean, the same thing with shale gas in the United States. I wasn't here for the shale gas discussion earlier, but when people were getting checks in their mailboxes, then they don't mind shale gas, right? If you're not getting a check in your mailbox, then you do mind shale gas. I mean, there's definitely a correlation. In terms of Desertec being a colonial project, if we think about what the British did in Egypt at the turn of the century, I mean, they went in, they took the cotton, they sent it back in Manchester to be milled, and they set laws down in Egypt to kill the local manufacturing of cloth. This is colonialism, in my mind. And what Desertec is saying, or what the German Aerospace Center said was, here's the deserts of the world, they could produce this, and if, I'm involved in the Desertec University Network, and if, that's my only affiliation with Desertec, but if Europe has a need, they have it to say, and we're not saying, or Desertec is not saying, or Europe is not saying, now we put plants in, we build them for you, and then we just deliver it to us. And there's even some people who say, well, as long as they get paid for it, who cares if that's how you did it? But it's actually, you know, here's the technology. I mean, there's actually going down there and giving them the technology, helping them figure out where they could put the plants, you know, build it, use local sources, use local people, train the local people, which is part of the idea of the Desertec University Network. They are completely allergic to the idea of it being colonialism and are actually bending over backwards to make sure it doesn't look like colonialism, because you've heard this, we've heard this, the solar colonialism, that's also been out there. But it doesn't fit the model for colonialism. It really doesn't. I mean, if we think about what was going on, for example, the British example I gave you, it doesn't look anything like that. Now, what worries me that it does look like that is this resource curse model. Here I have a more difficult time saying it wouldn't replicate a resource curse. I think, therefore, we have to go in with our eyes open and think about who is the money going to, how is it being shared. If it's ending up in a Swiss bank account, then you've just replicated the same problem all over again. And I think we should think about that now and avoid it now. So.
Right. And I think from everything we've heard today, looking at 9 billion people by 2050, the need to decarbonize energy systems extremely rapidly. We're going to need all sources, and I suspect that there'll be big ticket items and small distributed systems. Everything is going to be needed if we're going to get to the levels of low or no carbon technology that we have to have.
Yes, thank you, Joël Stolz. I'm the Vienna correspondent of Le Monde. This is more a question for Mr. Richert. You mentioned in your moderate scenario the probability of a food crisis. Could you elaborate on that? Would it affect, could it affect also Europe? Because it becomes immediately a matter of public security. And would it be caused by the disruption of transportation and of the food trade? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, sure. So the food industry is coupled very closely to the oil market, or the oil, like fuels in general. First thing is obviously transport. Second one is, and I have to admit now I'm lacking the English word for dünger. Fertilizers, right? That was easy. And so through fertilizers are produced to a substantial degree from what's refined from crude oil. So you have, if the oil price goes up, those prices go also up, and that combined with the transportation cost can rise food prices substantially. And I think this is something for global food prices. Then it's the question about resilience, who can pay that stuff. And I think Europeans will probably be best off there because this is where the money is. I think the situation will be much worse in countries which are not in the comfortable situation of being able to afford much higher food prices.
Sure. We just got time for a couple more on this side, then we'll have to round up. So we've got 3 here.
Hello, my name is Daniel. I'm an architect, and my question goes to you, Daniel. I would like to come back shortly to the Desert Tech project, because I also think that this is a project where we are repeating a mistake, what we have already done. My question is, I would like you to shortly frame somehow the potential of rebuilding local social and economic interdependencies, communities also in energy production, and how this idea could somehow distress the geopolitical crisis we have actually. Thank you.
A few years ago at the ASPA conferences, Rob Hopkins was here. Is he here now? Oh, is he here? No? Oh, that was just somebody raising his hand back. He built this model, Transition Towns, and what he believed in is actually local renewable solutions with respect among the generations, genders, and everybody working together. And I've studied what he has done, and I think that's very interesting. And I now have a lot of requests from different Swiss communities, because as a rule, the Swiss don't believe in top-down anyway. It's bottom-up or nothing. And these bottom-up processes of communities of maybe 10,000 people in a village, or half of it, I think they have a huge potential. I mean, I could elaborate a lot, but Transition Town is something I look at, and I look at how different areas in Germany, as the lady mentioned there, get a greater interest in renewable energies when they get the money. Because I, for instance, remember a debate that we had in Switzerland. I was there explaining peak oil, and Peter Foser was there on the podium. He's the CEO of Shell, and he's a Swiss, and the way they introduced me was, oh, this is a peak oil guy with a little institute, and this is Mr. Foser. His company made $7 billion last year, and then he said, well, that was in the first quarter. So the I fully back what Mike Klare actually says. The playing field is not even. It's not even at all. And we really have to keep this in mind, that nobody wants to give away a game that he's just cashing in every year. And it's difficult to make a transition, but I think it's necessary.
5 of the most profitable 10 companies in the world are oil companies. 2 more comments, and then I'm going to ask Rembrandt Koppelar to come up, and Michael and Georg just to tell us about some arrangements for tonight and logistics tomorrow.
Hello, Christian Kirschner from CRE Vienna and ICTA Barcelona. I would very much like to repeat also what's been said just before. I think with projects like Desert Tech, we are indeed repeating our old mistakes. Maybe it's not post-colonialism, but it's definitely post-extractivism. And apart from that, in this discussion, in the peak oil discussion in general, we do hear a lot about geopolitics, and we've talked about this today a lot. The reason we do that, I think, is because it's in our interest. What we don't talk a lot about is about political ecology and about the people involved in the places where we extract our resources from, and not only oil, but all resources, and the suffering that is going on in this region, and the conflicts that are going on just there. What is happening with resource scarcities and peak oil is we are advancing more and more into the what we call commodity frontiers. And Shell mentioned this today, the suffering of the Inuit communities due to the tar sands in Canada is only one example. The other one would be Amazon tribes who are just bashed away by local governments. The poor, and this is where we extract our resources from, sell cheap, and poor governments tend to sell cheap. And this is part of the problem which we are repeating.
Yep. And the last comment there, and then we'll have a couple of reactions to that as well. Okay.
Hi, Radek Wengchen. I'm the film director, and I just wanted to add in 2 keywords and maybe ask for 1 or 2 comments on that. One thing that that wasn't mentioned today that I think speeds up the whole process of conflicts, especially if we're talking geopolitical conflicts, is that a lot of countries are in the next 10 to 15 years going to be from net exporters to net importers. And that's a big thing, at least I think, in our research that we found out. And the other keyword, which is kind of linked to it as well, is generation conflict. We have a shitload of young people in those countries that are now major oil exporters that by the time, 2020, 2030, are going to be a lot of angry people if they don't have access to the money, to the wealth, and the energy. So one of the things that we're doing on our film, because I think it's very important, we kind of figured or found out that most of the decision makers today, by the time that the shit will hit the fan, 2020, 25, 2030, if we don't act fast, they're going to be dead. And we're going to have the problem, my generation and the younger generations. So I think that you strongly need to see this also from a perspective of a young person. And I think that most of the young people nowadays, and that doesn't matter whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the countries, they're asleep, but they're going to wake up one day. So maybe you can, from a geopolitical point of view, comment on that.
That's a great point. In fact, in the Netherlands, where I live, young people are doing that. Young people are now getting back into politics. Final comments from the panel, and then I'll ask Rembrandt to make some comments.
I think bringing up energy poverty is actually a very, very good starting point for what I want to say. There's an amazing amount of energy poverty in North Africa. There is energy poverty. When Desert Tech came out in 2009, there were the great headlines, 15% of Europe's energy by 2050. But actually, these headlines obscured the real vision of Desert Tech, which was that these countries would also be getting renewable energy, right? So to be at a conference where we talk about peak oil and we talk about environmental degradation and we talk about carbon, and to say, but it's colonialism if we give them the technology to have renewable energy. Something's missing, right? If they get, my viewpoint is, if they get renewable energy, that's fantastic. And if Europe gets whatever remnants are left over after they've supplied themselves, fine. I'm not one for, let's just build a bunch of plants and run a bunch of wires. I mean, this is what the maps look like, but this is abstractions, right? But the actual vision itself is for supplying those regions. It's a grid that goes around the whole Mediterranean, meaning they're all interconnected. And that's why my whole point about the terrorist threat, you can't cut a line to Europe. It's not possible. You would accidentally perhaps trigger lines for your whole area. So not to be caught up in these headlines, but really, if we can provide the world with renewable energy, let's do it, and let's do it fast, let's do it centralized, let's do it decentralized, let's do whatever we can. And when I've asked many people, I mean, this morning we heard that 2/3 of the world lives in cities, and cities are 2/3 of the world's carbon. I've asked many people, can you provide cities with local decentralized energy? And the answer has always been no, you can't do it. You cannot provide the cities. I mean, maybe you can if you happen to live near CSP somewhere, or if you fit everywhere with photovoltaic, but what I've heard, I've asked Daniele Kamin this last year, is that rapidly there is no way. So we need to do everything possible. I mean, everything, and not just focus on one energy or that energy. Let's just throw everything behind renewable energies and do it as fast as we can.
Great.
I want to thank the people who made those last comments. I think they were very helpful. And my response will be to say this. We're at a peak oil conference, and we're used to talking about pre-peak and peak oil and post-peak. I prefer to talk about a transition from easy oil or easy energy to extreme energy, because I think that better describes the situation we're facing. And by extreme energy, I mean energy that has to be extracted or acquired through the use of force. Now, that could be more force in the sense of, as we heard earlier, energy in for energy out, using more forcible means of extraction. Shale oil and shale gas extraction is extremely aggressive. Tar sands is extremely aggressive. other forms of energy, Arctic and deep oil are extremely aggressive forms of energy extraction. That's extreme energy. But more and more it's going to require military force, extreme in that sense. So I think this is a better way of characterizing the era we're in, and this brings us closer to the concerns that were raised in the sense that this will be the people at the other end of this assault. I think we should describe this as invasion, aggression, assault are going to be bitterly and painfully hurt by this. The people, the environment, the Arctic is under assault this summer, and the people who live there will be assaulted, and they are protesting as best they possibly can. The species that live there are going to be assaulted and badly damaged, and the poor and poor people, of course, will be hurt by this. So I think if you characterize what's happening in these last days of oil as aggression, it's a better way to say we have to stop this kind of aggression, that it's a better way of mobilizing people against it. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Karin.
What the film director mentioned about the angry young people, and I would focus on angry young men, that's not something that in my eyes is going to happen in 2030 or later. It has started to happen very bluntly last year in 2011 because the Arab revolts and different rebellions were all about the youth bulge problem. Of course nobody could predict the date the revolutions would start, but any demographic study of the last 15 years, whether it was World Bank, whether it was UNDP, would predict, be aware, one day these baby boomers of the 1980s will wake up, and the moment they will not anymore be able to afford establishing a family and will not be able to get married, etc., that will become a social-political problem. And that's already there. And as I like to point out, orientation might stem semantically from Orient, and what started in the Orient has already ignited numerous other societies. People standing in Wisconsin, we are all Egyptians, in mid-February last year. I mean, that was just one example among many others, the different Occupy movements. And I think that what I fear, what we are seeing right now here is with this the end of social peace in countries that were used to rely on steady flow of energy, as has been mentioned, on social peace, on fixed perspectives, will hit especially hard as a younger generation, today's teens and twins, who might have more problems to live without that security. And here I fear that this absence of security, the impoverishing of society that is already starting. It's not something that is to happen in a decade. It's there. And the absence of means to really make the transition. I mean, in Germany, you already heard debates a year ago, 2 years ago, which money will be left for doing the transition of the energy system, since we are paying all those olive-eating people. I mean, that was not a debate from blue-collar workers somewhere in the suburbs. No, you would hear it in conferences. And here I see the big problem is, again, a renationalization, first me and my energy security, in order to keep social peace. I mean, this is something that is really happening right now within Europe. So the continent that currently is in a deep quagmire, but which I see in the long run moving out of it, is Africa. It is rich in terms of commodities. It has a different demographic structure than we do. And I think that if Africa manages to overcome its energy poverty by whichever means, whether that might be decentralized renewables or whether it might be very cheap Chinese-made solar cells, which might make the African energy revolution to happen much more quickly than all the nice plans by UN and EU-sponsored organizations, whatever it might be. But here is I see it with a little bit of more optimistic perspective that on that continent something will move out because they are simply rich in terms of commodities, which we never were. And that's why we started colonialism.
Thanks. Daniel, then Jörn, just quite short.
A closing remark. My main point, and that's what I share with I guess everybody here on the podium, is that first we have to become very aware how serious the situation is. I always have this feeling that in the room we all agree, and then when you walk out, you're like, what were we talking about? The world looks so completely different. People don't talk about this at all. And this is something that I try to take outside into my country and talk to people about it. First they say, no, it's not possible. I've heard there's oil for 40 years. How can it be that what strange conference did you attend in Vienna and whatever? But then the question of the generation question, I think, is a very important one, because for me, it will stay with me, this debate, until I die. I'm now 40. If I die at 80, it will be 2050. So I think the whole thing is really in my life. So I will not leave the debate and say, oh, I'm not interested anymore. It's just fallen in front of my feet. My kids are 3 and 6 years old, so they will certainly be in it. And that's, I think, the strength of our group now. I connect with a lot of people of the same age, and we learn from Colin, and we learn from Paul, and the elder statesman, if you want, and then from Michael, Klare. We learn it, but then we will have to solve it. I hope we'll do well. I hope. We'll see.
Thank you.
Well, it's hard to say something else because you basically stole my point. In general, I would just say, like, all the things we talked about are really complex, and I think complex can always also be boring from the perspective of an individual person which is not into energy. I think everyone who sits here reads a lot about energy, thinks a lot about energy, watches TV shows about energy, whatever. So energy is like a substantial part of life and work. But I think there are a lot of people out there who have their own jobs, who have their own interests, who have families and all that. And energy becomes a very small part of their lives. And I think it's a really very important thing to communicate what was talked about here to those people. And there are two things which were said before. One is, okay, people get interested when they see the check in the mailbox. And the other one was, everyone is responsible for what's happening, for example, in Nigeria. And I think these are two things which we should bring to the people. And just to close with something you said in the break, actually, is probably should hit something like the sweet spot of people listening. So not going so extreme that they get fatalistic and just turn off and don't do anything, but interest them into the issues which were talked about and not letting them out there being disinterested about energy issues.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jörn, and thank you all the panel.